Hello and welcome to Chrontendo episode 11, and I am Dr. Sparkle, your host. And you know what? I think we actually have a pretty good selection of games this episode. We're smack in the middle of autumn 1986, and this episode we have a really classic game from Konami, as well as a pretty good game from Capcom. We've got interesting new titles from Hudson and from Nintendo. We have a pretty good shoot 'em up this episode, and a text adventure game, and even some kind of oddball games. So let's get started. Chrontendo episode 10 is another one of those episodes where one game really seems to stand heads and tails above all the rest. And no, this is not that game. This is I Am a Teacher, Kiami no Kizu. And as you can plainly see, this is also a knitting instructional game. Well, we really shouldn't call it a game, it's merely an instructional FDS disc. So once again, you pick a sweater, put in the measurements, it'll actually tell you how much yarn you need to buy. And then you can see how to actually make the various little loops and whatnot using the knitting needles. I'm really not quite sure what the idea behind this disc was. It seems that learning how to knit might be easier from a book or something like that, or taking knitting classes. I guess if you were feeling sort of modern and contemporary and didn't want to learn something from a book, you could have bought this thing. I assume this is sort of marketed towards housewives and whatnot. I guess I Am a Teacher is pretty typical of some of the sort of strange stuff we'll be seeing for the FDS. Well, this was the second and last of Royal Kogyo's games. It's interesting, there's no Nintendo characters in this one, but it's still copyrighted to Nintendo, which raises the possibility that Nintendo themselves may have actually developed this. One nice feature, it seems that it actually allows you to save the projects that you're working on. Well, I guess this game might be fun for fans of hot knitting action. Anybody else, people who don't knit or aren't into instructional discs, I guess perhaps this is not really the game for you. Okay, admittedly that first game wasn't very impressive, but this one is a lot better. It's Akumajo Dracula, better known in the US as Castlevania. This is the FDS version where you can actually save your game. And note that weird little skull with the bloody nail through the eye. That particular screen does not exist in the Western version. I believe there were a few minor details that were censored for the release of Castlevania in the US. Here's the more familiar US title screen. And we get this very spooky, atmospheric opening cutscene here. In this game, you play Simon Belmont, vampire hunter extraordinaire, off to settle a score with Dracula. You're armed with this famed whip known as the Vampire Killer, but apparently it can't be that great because you almost immediately ditch it for some other weapon you find just laying around in the graveyard. If you've never played Castlevania before, well, please be aware it's a great game. Graphically, this is almost certainly the most impressive looking game we've seen on the FamiCom so far. This is one of the few games that really manages to create like a real kind of spooky atmosphere. The music is also very effective. This is the famous Vampire Killer theme music being played on this level. The platformer was rapidly becoming one of the more popular genres on the FamiCom. However, since Mario Brothers, we haven't really seen a whole lot of really great platformers, and this is really certainly one of them. Compared to a lot of the other games we've been seeing that are similar to this, this one really is sort of heads and shoulders above the rest. As we saw there, you will need to break apart the occasional wall to find some sort of hidden item. In that case, it was a turkey, which will give you some additional health. Why there's a turkey hidden in the castle wall is anybody's guess. I expect it probably certainly wouldn't be fresh. You also whip the various candlestick holders in order to get hearts. Now, hearts don't refill your health, despite what you might think. They actually refill your secondary weapon meter. Every time you grab a heart, that's one time you can use your secondary weapon. In this case, it's the little dagger that appears here. Now, this game consists of either 6 or 7 levels, depending on if you count the boss, Dracula's Chamber, as a final level. And this is the end of the first one. At the end of every level there is a boss of some sort. In this case it's a relatively easy vampire bat. This game actually ramps up the difficulty of the bosses reasonably gently, so you're not going to be too frustrated when you face this first boss, especially if you have the right secondary weapon. In a concept that was later used in Mega Man, having the right secondary weapon will make certain bosses go a lot easier, with the exception of the first form of Dracula himself. And the game is nice enough to refill your health bar after you're done with the boss, unlike a certain other game which we'll see later in this episode. Because this first level is relatively easy, you might be sort of lured into a false sense of security that this is not a difficult game, but actually it does get difficult, especially in the later levels. Luckily you have 3 lives and infinite continues. There are certainly some issues that make this game a bit more difficult than it would be. For example, whenever an enemy hits you, you actually get knocked back a little bit. This can be very dangerous when around these levels where you can fall to your death very easily. Certain enemies, such as those Medusa heads and these hunchbacks, can be notoriously difficult to actually hit. They tend to move around in patterns that make them sort of difficult, like the hunchbacks usually land either right behind you or right in front of you and then run forward and smack into you. Additionally, when you jump, you can't change your character's direction in mid-jump. In other words, if you jump and suddenly an enemy appears, you often smack right into them. Staircases can also be a bit tricky. You can only whip directly in front of you, so you can't really attack enemies that are above or below you. And also it's quite easy to accidentally fall off a staircase and fall to your death if you're not careful. In later levels of the game, every single hit takes off a pretty good chunk of your life bar, and healing items are pretty scarce. There is the occasional chunk of beef or turkey wing hidden in the wall, but they really don't happen that frequently. This is a rather effective secondary weapon, a stopwatch that'll allow you to temporarily freeze all the enemies on a screen. At any rate, in later games in the series, your character became a lot easier to control, so that's led some people to categorize this first game as perhaps having sort of bad controls, but that's really not the case at all. I mean, if you've compared some of the other games that we've played to this one, you'll see the controls are actually very good. Here's the Frankenstein boss. He can be a bit tricky if you don't have the holy water, which will temporarily freeze an enemy. This is one of the coolest looking levels in the game, the clock tower level. We're getting quite close here to Dracula. I mean, seriously, compare this to some earlier platformers. I mean, ones that came out, just like a month or so before this, say Musashi no Ken, and you'll really see how much better this game looks in comparison. There are really very few games that attempt to put this much time, effort, and detail into the way a game looks. Finally, we come to Dracula himself. He can be a bit tricky because you can only hit him directly in the face, and only for a very brief second before he disappears. He also tends to materialize right on top of you and throw fireballs at you as well. However, with a few tries, you can get through the guy. He's definitely not impossible. And he does have a second form, which is actually a bit easier because you can use the holy water on him. You know, looking at this game in the context of what else is coming out at around this time, you really have to hand it to Ookami. Out of all the major arcade manufacturers, Konami was really the one who seemed to understand what the FamiCom was all about. Remember, at this stage, Taito was mostly releasing just arcade ports and mediocre original games like Musashi no Ken. Namco was maybe doing a little bit better, but really nothing even close to the level of something like this. The fact that Konami released Castlevania, Goonies, and Ganbara Goemon all within such short period of time really indicates that they understood where the FamiCom was going. Out of all the third-party developers making games to the FamiCom, really only Konami and Hudson Soft seem to be dedicated to turning out quality games. Well, at this stage here I've defeated Dracula, and now the castle will collapse into the ground, which is probably not a good thing because as far as I can tell, I'm still in it, right? I'm surprised Simon wasn't killed when the whole thing came crashing down like that. Well, needless to say, Castlevania was a success in Japan, and it was released in the United States as well as Europe. And this was the first in a long series of games, which is actually still around today. This series would change over the years, but the games would remain pretty consistently good, with the entries for the PC Engine and the PlayStation being considered to be all-time classics. And then of course we get these ridiculous closing credits with all these fake names. Much has been made about the hero's name appearing as Simon Belmondo in the credits. Perhaps some people thought that maybe the name was changed for the final release. However, I assume that's actually just sort of a little joke in reference to the French actor Jean-Paul Belmondo, who's pretty well known, at least up into the 70s and 80s. Maybe he was still popular in Japan at this time. So, in closing, Castlevania, not the best game in the series, but still an awesome game, and let's hope that more games on the FamiCom will be able to live up to this standard. Released one day after Akumajo Dracula was Capcom's Senjou no Ookami, known in the West as Commando. This is based on Capcom's enormously successful 1985 arcade game. The basic concept for Commando was taken from an earlier game called Frontline, the FamiCom port of which was discussed several episodes ago. However, Capcom's game was much superior to the earlier Frontline, and pretty much popularized the entire vertically scrolling one or two men versus an entire army genre. The objective of this game is to destroy a series of enemy bases in some sort of unspecified enemy country, and rescue POWs while you're at it. The very cool Japanese title translates into Wolf of the Battlefield. The English title was presumably inspired by the 1985 Arnold Schwarzenegger movie Commando, even though the game is not actually related to that film. In Commando, you control the small blue soldier who's armed with a machine gun against countless enemy soldiers. Commando is not an easy game. The arcade version is known for being pretty difficult. And this is a one-hit, you get killed game. There's no life bar or anything like that. Since you're often surrounded by enemies, being hit is actually quite simple. Luckily, the enemy soldiers are not very smart and often run away from you or do not fire at you when they're quite close, otherwise the game would be virtually impossible. Occasionally, you'll come across another soldier in blue. That's one of the POWs. One thing about Commando is that the previous Capcom games were ported to the FamiCom in a somewhat shoddy fashion by Micronix. Commando is the first FamiCom Capcom game to actually be ported by Capcom themselves. So I guess this is sort of Capcom's official entry into the world of console games. How does it actually turn out? Well, certainly it's a lot better than Sun, but perhaps not as good as you might hope. This game is reasonably accurate to the arcade version, but is still slightly ugly looking. Incidentally, this is sort of almost like the first boss battle here. There's no real boss, but you do have to face an extraordinary number of enemy soldiers that keep pouring out at you. Now, one thing that Capcom did do for this port is they did add a few features, such as hidden areas. If you throw a grenade right there, you can go down to a little underground passage and find some POWs, as well as some extra grenades. When I first saw this, I thought, well, what are these guys doing? It looks like they're going to the bathroom or something, but no, they're actually facing forwards with their hands tied behind their backs. They have no faces, making that somewhat difficult to distinguish, so you actually run and touch them and free them. Of course, Capcom would eventually become quite well known for making a lot of changes and enhancing the home versions of their arcade games. While the changes in Commando are quite minor, you can see that Capcom is embarking on the path that would lead to games like Bionic Commando much later. People who are quite familiar with the arcade version might find the FamiCom version to be a little strange. The controls are actually quite a bit different, switching from a joystick which can kind of be swung around to a D-pad. The actual gameplay feel is substantially different. Of course, once you get the hang of it, it becomes quite a bit easier. Well, here I've destroyed the final base. Don't know why those flames are purple. I like the little hearts in the congratulations message. Then the helicopter picks you up and starts you all over again. So I'm going to say that Commando is a pretty good game once you get the hang of it. I was somewhat skeptical of the home version of Commando at first. There's actually countless bad home conversions of this for various computers and whatnot. But the Nintendo one is certainly the best. Once I sort of got the hang of the controls, I found it to actually be a very enjoyable and playable game. And this is a game that was released the same day as Commando. It's Terra Cresta from Nichibutsu. This game was originally for the arcades in 1985, and as you might recall, Nichibutsu were also the guys who made Magmax. Terra Cresta resembles Magmax in that you go around picking up ship parts, which can be added to your craft and will make you more powerful. These are basically the power-ups of the game. Additionally, these extra ship parts will add as a buffer when you're hit. I believe Nichibutsu ported this game to the FamiCom themselves, and they did a pretty good job, though the first thing you might think when you see this is, hey, it looks just like Commando, at least the background does. They've used the same sort of orangish color for the ground. I guess that was sort of becoming the default ground color for the sort of FamiCom, which had limited color palette. I just picked up the first part. Another minor graphical difference is the dinosaurs do not move at all in this game. In the arcade version, they slowly inch forward. Terra Cresta is one of those somewhat simple shooters, and since you only have one fire button and really only one method of fire, there's no bombs or anything like this. You actually destroy things on the ground simply by shooting them with your regular laser. Now, of course, I can shoot both forward and behind, as well as having some kind of extra little additional laser type thing there. Now, one of the cool things about this game is once you get all the parts, you actually temporarily transform into a giant phoenix. Here's the first boss. So you're always sort of, I mean, that's kind of like your main goal, is to get sort of see yourself transform into the phoenix. I'm not sure how many levels there are. I have not actually played this game all the way through to the end. Ah, and here we go. So you're temporarily indestructible and able to kill enemies just by touching them. Yeah, that's kind of the cool part of the game right there, but the whole thing is pretty good. Perhaps not the best shooter that's ever come out, but certainly a lot better than many of the things that we've been seeing for the FamiCom, so I'd say this is actually a pretty good game. From Data East, we now have another port of an antique arcade game. First of all, notice how ugly this title screen is, not to mention the fact there's no music. Yes, this is Buggy Popper, released in the US as Bump and Jump. This is a port of the 1982 Data East arcade game, Bump and Jump, otherwise known as Burnin' Rubber. Now, I will confess, as a very young person, I do remember this game in the arcades and enjoyed it quite a bit. I think maybe it had something to do with the uniqueness of the gameplay and the rather interesting looking enemy cars that were on the screen. The FamiCom version changes the graphics a bit and adds a new feature, namely fuel. There are fuel canisters you have to pick up in the middle of the road. The story behind this game is that, well, you know, once again your girlfriend has been kidnapped and you have to rescue her. Apparently this is an excuse to go out on the freeway and commit massive vehicular homicide. That part of the game is actually a bit puzzling. I mean, certainly not every single guy on the road can be an enemy. We must assume that since it's a public freeway, at least most of the people are innocent bystanders. Why'd you get points for killing every single person on the road? Well, luckily you're equipped with a very special vehicle. It's a buggy of some sort that can actually propel itself up in the air towards the viewer. Then it can land on top of enemy cars, as well as jump over the rather large gaps in the freeway that appear. Which raises another question, why does this freeway have such big chunks missing out of it? Is this unfinished? If so, why are they letting people drive on it? I guess we really shouldn't expect logic from a video game, but this game does seem pretty odd. So anyway, about the Famicom version, yeah, it's okay. I guess it sort of plays like the original arcade version. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the charm has been lost in the conversion. The vehicles don't really look anything like they did in the arcade game. Maybe I'm just being nostalgic for the original version, but this game seems to be somehow lacking to me. This game did get a US release in 1988 by Vic Tokai. Why did they release this game so late? I really don't know. This game had been ported many times before, even as far back as on the 2600. I guess Vic Tokai just didn't have anything better to put out. And here's another FDS title. I guess we'll take a break from arcade ports for a little bit and look at an original game. And this is Othello. Released by the mysterious Kawada. I really have no idea who these guys are, and I don't know if they released any other games. The title screen here also credits Sakuda. They are the Japanese company that actually manufactured the Othello board games and has the name Othello copyrighted. Well, first of all, you choose your difficulty, and you choose your color, and you put in your name, and then you're ready to play Othello. This game was pretty popular back in the 70s and 80s. It's actually, the idea is pretty old. There have been other board games similar to this, though really it's the modern Japanese version of Othello that's played mostly nowadays. In this case, I am white, and you can place your piece on the board so that you have two pieces surrounding one of the opponent's pieces. Once you do this, then the opponent's pieces flip over. If you can't find a place where you can flip an opponent's piece, you then have to forfeit your turn. Othello is sort of a weird game. For those who remember the game that came out in the 70s in the US, the motto on the box was "A minute to learn, a lifetime to master." And yes, the rules are very simple, but actually winning a game is not so simple, especially against a computer, because it's actually not very hard to make a computer program that'll beat actually any human Othello player on Earth. Unlike games like chess or Go, a computer can pretty much easily defeat a human being. When you play this game, don't be fooled into thinking that just because you have more pieces on the board than your opponent that you're actually winning. Things can actually turn around quite quickly at the end of the game. In fact, during the end of the game, you'll see massive numbers of pieces changing color constantly. I think really one of the best strategies, and this is what the computer seems to do, is to make diagonal rows of pieces which head towards the corners. If you are new to the game of Othello and you try playing this computer program, you'll probably get your ass handed to you pretty easily. A couple interesting things about this game. This was released for the FDS, but it was released on cartridge only around a month later. Something else that's noteworthy is this is the first FamiCom game, at least I believe it is, developed by HAL Laboratory. HAL would eventually get very close ties to Nintendo, becoming sort of a second-party developer for Nintendo, making games like the Kirby games and Super Smash Bros. In fact, the current president of Nintendo was actually the ex-president of HAL. They actually started publishing games themselves in December of '86, so we'll be seeing a lot more of them. And we have another Famicom Disk System game from Nintendo themselves, known in the US as Pro Wrestling, and known in Japan as Pro Wrestling Famicom Wrestling Association. Now, this is actually the third wrestling game for the Famicom, and by the way, here on the introduction we see the sort of the various characters introduced, and they're all playable. The first wrestling game was, of course, the Kinnikuman game known as Muscle in the US. Second one was Tag Team Wrestling. And then we have this one, which is actually far and away the best of the two. I'm controlling Fighter Hayabusa there. He's sort of the normal looking guy. Starman, which is sort of the mysterious alien wrestler dude. Now this actually works relatively similar to tag team wrestling. One button controls punches, the other controls kicks. The kicks are much more effective. Most effectively, however, if you walk up to an opponent and hit the punch button, you will go into a grapple. Once you're in the grapple, hitting a certain button combination will perform some sort of special move. These moves are usually some kind of throw or a slam or something like that. While your opponent's down, you can grab them in the head, you can jump on them, and of course you can pin an opponent. So while in theory this really isn't that different than tag team wrestling, the actual execution is quite a lot better. And the players are a lot of fun. You sort of have, each player has its own special move, like I just did the brain kick there that Fighter Hayabusa has, which unfortunately misses much more than it actually connects. In fact, I'd say of all the characters, he's perhaps in some ways the worst. Some of the other unique fighter moves are much more effective. And the kick is actually pretty effective as well. You can run and do try to do like a clothesline or something, but I have a hard time getting this to actually work, to actually connect with the other guy. And this game is well loved for, among other things, the famous "A winner is you" screen after you actually won a match. So once you win one match, you then go on to the next fighter and so on until you become the champion. I guess the actual structure of the game is similar to Punch-Out, which of course had not yet come out for the FamiCom. And yeah, you can throw your opponents against the ropes, smash into them, throw your opponent out of the ring. Here I'm finding is one of the more crazy creatures, the Amazon. He has a few crazy moves up his sleeve. It's really hard to say why the FamiCom had 3 wrestling games at this point. There was one baseball game, one golf game, only a couple mahjong games, no boxing games. Why so many wrestling games? Oh, I don't know, I guess just sort of the way it worked out. Wrestling was of course pretty popular in Japan. One thing I actually wish this game had was some sort of health or life meter, because you really don't know how much damage is being done to you as compared to the other guy. Oh, there I just did one of my special moves as the Amazon. And here's another one of the wrestlers. He has like a headbutt move, which is actually pretty cool. And that's actually pretty effective. So once again, pro wrestling. This is the first quality wrestling game we've seen for the FamiCom, and definitely the one you'll want to play. The last time we heard from Jalico was with Jajamaru no Daiboken. And here we have another game from them that unfortunately is not quite as fun. This game is called Urusei Yatsura, Lum no Wedding Bell, and it is based on a licensed property, namely the popular anime and manga Urusei Yatsura. One of the extremely odd things about this game, it was also released in an arcade version, the same year, 1986, but the arcade version was Momoko 120%. Apparently they had the rights for the Urusei license on the FamiCom version, but they could not use them for the arcade version. So they changed the arcade game to like this completely generic character here. Why the game is called Momoko 120%, I'm really not sure. In this game you play one of the main characters of the manga, that's Lum. She's an alien being with little horns on her head, and apparently can throw lightning bolts. And for some reason, your school is always on fire. The game starts off in what I assume is preschool, then moves on to elementary school, junior high, so on and so forth. It ends with you actually getting married, hence the name. The object of each level is to use the escalators, or, sometimes there's trampolines, to get onto the roof of the school, and then escape in your UFO. If you do not do this quickly enough, you will burn in the fire which is raging in the basement. As I mentioned, this game is really not that fun. One of the issues that I find with this game is simply the fact that you're pretty much being spammed by enemies at all time. It's sometimes difficult to move forward because there are constantly enemies coming your way, and all you have is this ridiculous little lightning bolt to fend them off with. Here we see the between-level cutscene. Your character grows up a little bit and is now on to the next grade. Well, anyway, sometimes you find yourself needing to jump across a gap, but being unable to simply because there's too many enemies coming towards you. This is especially true when you have to use little handbars to cross a gap because you can't fire. Sometimes there's like a never-ending row of enemies, and you can zap them with your lightning, but since they don't actually stop coming, you have a difficult time crossing the gap in time. And also, quite frankly, it is rather difficult to hit anything with your lightning bolt. The enemies often fly too high to be hit. That was one of the bonus rounds right there. Altogether there are 6 levels. There's 4 grades of... Oops, I fell into the fire there. 4 grades of school. Oh, here I'm in junior high. For some reason, guys in little black suits start appearing. Oh, and then there's those horrible cat things. And, sometimes they actually fall on you while you're in the middle of making a jump. Jalico has a pretty mixed record when it comes to FamiCom games so far, and this one is probably going to be, in my opinion, one of the least interesting games they've come up with. See, once again you see the problem of never getting an opportunity to actually jump across that gap there. So I'd say sort of stay away from this one. It might be interesting if you're a fan of the series, but other than that, there's probably really no reason to play this. Oh boy, it's time for more educational games. These are the next 2 cartridges released by Tokyo Tosheki, the Japanese textbook publisher. The first one covers 4th grade, and the second covers 5th and 6th grade. And for those who need a reminder, these are sort of the follow-ups to Senjou 1, 2, and 3 Toshi. However, compared to those 3 games, these are actually a bit of a ripoff. Instead of 4 games per cartridge, you only get 2. Or rather, you get 4, but they're repeated. There are several variations on the same game on each cartridge. And very oddly, number 5 and 6 has a rather non-educational looking and rather dull horizontal shoot-'em-up. The other game on this title is sort of like a game where you have to go around spraying garden pest with bug spray. I guess there's nothing like teaching environmentally friendly values to kids at a young age. So just like the first 3, these really have no gaming value and are only of interest to obsessives like myself. And the last game, released in October of 1986, is Mississippi Satsujin Jiken, or Mississippi Murder Case. You might notice the Activision copyright there. This is a port of their game originally for the Commodore 64. And this game is a text-adventure style game, but not the same kind of adventure game that Portopia was. This is a sort of distinctly American brand. I believe the first game that kind of invented this particular subgenre was King's Quest. Basically, you actually control a character that you can move around and then grab objects, talk to people, that sort of thing. As opposed to a game like Portopia, which is strictly, a static illustration and then completely text-based. In this game, you play an amateur detective who investigates a murder that occurred on the riverboat. You can go into different people's rooms, talk to people there, look around, look for clues, find items. There's like commands, like for example there's the move command, which allows you to start moving again. And there's like the look command, and when you come across a person there's like a talk command, and like another menu will open up like what do you want to talk about. It actually plays sort of similarly to Portopia. I guess around this time Activision suddenly realized that there was a lucrative Japanese market for video games because we had the licensed property of Pitfall, which came out with Super Pitfall. Then there was this game, and then there of course was Ghostbusters as well. I've actually discovered the corpse here. The credits for the US version say it was created by Adam Bellin, who was a developer at Activision who helped design the game Ghostbusters. Apparently he did the music for it. And this game was, at least the original Commodore 64 version, was produced by Brad Fregger, who also produced Pitfall 2 and Ghostbusters. So all these games seem to have something in common. Here we're going to question a possible witness or suspect. Ask him what she knows about the dead man. One thing that's different about this game from Portopia is it's actually possible to lose. You can get killed in the game, as we'll see here in just a moment when a knife hits me. So this is certainly really not a bad game. It's pretty typical of adventure games of this particular era. However, if you do want to play this, you might be better off playing the Commodore 64 version because it's in English, and the games are really quite similar. This is another FDS game, and as you probably noticed, they're coming out quite frequently. This is actually the 4th one this episode. So quite a bit has changed since from back when they were only coming out like one game every 2 months. This is Ginga Denshou Galaxy Odyssey. And this is a rather curious little game. You might remember the shoot 'em up Galg from a while ago. That was considered to be sort of a shoot 'em up RPG. Well, this is actually something quite similar. I guess you might picture this game as sort of being a cross between a shoot 'em up and Zelda. This was the first game for the FamiCom from a publisher called Imagineer. They're actually a pretty prolific publisher of no particular speciality. Over the years, they've released things like the Sims games in Japan, the Madden football games, and of course a lot of original games as well. I believe this is actually developed by a company called Wavejack, about which I really don't know much. I couldn't find very many other games they developed. One thing you'll probably instantly pick up on is the enemies here take multiple hits to kill. That is some sort of violation of an unspoken rule in shoot 'em ups, is that there don't seem to be any one-hit kill enemies in this. And whenever you hit something, you tend to pick up 2 different types of capsules. The small ones are energy, or maybe oxygen, and the larger ones are actually money. Now those energy capsules, or oxygen capsules as I'll call them, those are counted in the little number up in the upper right hand corner there. Once you have enough, you can hit one of those letters, and then basically it'll become kind of like a top-down Zelda action-adventure game. Once we get past all the loading screens here. And here we go, now you can run around and shoot things. Oh, I actually got like an oxygen refill there, that's what that little red beaker was. As you can see, my oxygen is constantly counting down. Oh, and here I've got missiles. I have a 3-button life bar on the upper left side there. Though, as you go through the game, you'll get powered up and get more. Hitting the select button will bring up this screen. It'll tell you which items you have. Which, I guess we'll call them dungeons that you've completed. There's A through Z. So, more or less, the object of this game is to fly around, get money, get oxygen, then explore the dungeons, and so on and so forth. There's actually even item shops in this, where you can power up your vehicle. For example, there's one found in the A dungeon. This game might remind you of a later game from Compile called The Guardian Legend. I wouldn't say this is as good as that game, but it's an interesting idea. Truthfully, the game is sort of long and boring. And it'll probably take you a while to get through it. Some of these dungeons are actually quite long. Here's the shop. And you can buy more powerful lasers. Other dungeons will have shops where you can buy better shields and more life. All kinds of stuff. While this is all very interesting, the game itself isn't actually very good. The shoot-'em-up sections are not a whole lot of fun. They're sort of boring and repetitive. The dungeon sections are very long and tricky, and of course you have to find hidden passages, that sort of thing, all while on a pretty strict timer. Of course, you've got to give Imagineer and Wavejack credit for trying something a little different. From the rather notorious Kemco, we have Super Star Force. This is a FamiCom original and the official sequel to Star Force. Oddly, Hudson had already released a semi-sequel to Star Force, namely Star Soldier. Of the two, Star Soldier is the much better game. One odd little thing I've noticed about the FamiCom is the way that a series of very similar games will be released almost simultaneously. For example, Star Force was released only 5 days after Ginga Denshou, yet these games are both shoot-'em-ups with RPG features. First of all, let me say this game is marginally better than the original Star Force. The graphics are really not half bad, and the asteroid things you fly over are pretty nicely detailed. However, what exactly is the story with the star fields? You notice that all the stars are lined up in diagonal lines. This game features pretty standard shoot-'em-up action, though occasionally your ship will fly over little boxes that represent either shops or warp zones. In the shops you can buy various power-ups from like a little wizard dude. The warp zones, however, will let you warp either backwards or forwards in time. I just warped to DA 1301 apparently, back when the universe was covered in water. As you travel through time, you'll find the appearance of the world changes. At one point you can even warp back into the present day where you'll fly over a modern city. Of course, while this is an interesting gimmick, it doesn't really affect the gameplay, and at heart, Super Star Force is basically an average shooter, nothing more. This is Bandai's family trainer, Athletic World, and it's the first game to make use of their FamiCom accessory, the Family Trainer. In the US, this was released as the Power Pad. Apparently, Nintendo must have been quite pleased with Bandai's creation, because they purchased the rights to release it themselves in the US. I'm sure you recall this particular accessory if you had a Nintendo back in the 1980s. The Power Pad is a thin mat that registers movement when you step on it. In this case, as you run and jump on the pad, so does your character. In the US version of the game, you can enter in your name, age, and sex, as you can see here. There are several different gameplay variations in Athletic World, but they're all pretty similar. They pretty much all involve running and jumping on the mat. This, for example, is a very simple race with hurdles. In the dark tunnel, you jog along some sort of pyramid or something like that. The Family Trainer and the Power Pad must have been reasonably successful because they released, maybe about 10 games or so altogether for it. One thing that is interesting to note about this game is it was actually developed by Human Entertainment. Human was a Japanese development company and publisher that started up in 1983, began publishing games themselves in 1990, and finally went out of business in 1999. They are definitely a bit more reputable than the likes of Toza, who developed most of the prior Bandai games. Perhaps Human's most well-known series in the United States is the Clock Tower games. As for the Power Pad, we'll discuss this more when we look at some of the later Family Trainer games. Hudson followed up Adventure Island with this title, Meikyuu Kumikyoku, which literally means May Sweet. The word sweet in the title is appropriate since this game has sort of a musical theme. The English title is Milon's Secret Castle, undoubtedly referred to by many folks as Milton's Secret Castle. The character's Japanese name seems to be Miron or Milon, but we'll refer to him as Milon. The plot involves Milon having to collect a series of crystal balls which are scattered throughout his castle. Apparently the castle has been taken over by some sort of villainous fellow named Maharito. Milon has to work his way up 4 floors, each of which have several rooms. Along the way he'll make occasional side trips, such as going down a well at one point. Now here we see the first room of the castle. Getting through this involves finding the hidden key as well as the hidden exit door. Along the way, you'll want to look and try to find a lot of various hidden items, for example the money that we just found. Other things you can find include the Hudson B logo. Collecting that will give you a temporary shield. Another hidden item you'll find is a honeycomb that will increase your life bar by 1 point. Now, a lot of people find this game to be very difficult and rather unpleasant, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that virtually everything you need to get in this game is hidden. You have to be constantly looking for things with your little bubble there. There's the honeycomb. Something else that makes this game quite difficult is the fact that unlike a lot of these kind of games, when you're hit by an enemy you don't get a moment of temporary invulnerability. If you get hit, you can get hit again instantly, and often an enemy passing through will register several hits. Sometimes if you get stuck in a little nook like this one right here, an enemy can do quite a bit of damage to you. And a lot of the enemies will make a very fast beeline right towards you, or at very least throw some kind of projectile at you. So I can certainly imagine that a lot of folks tried playing this game, found it rather frustrating, and then gave up quite quickly. This is too bad because once you get the hang of it, it's actually a reasonably fun game, even though there are certainly some things that make it a bit unpleasant at times. Sometimes hitting the flying enemies can be very difficult. So the sheer number of dangerous enemies and the rather maze-like quality of some of the levels can make this game a little rough at times. Luckily, once you get past the first boss, you do have an unlimited number of continues. So once you've gotten past the first few rooms, you then go back outdoors, and eventually you'll run into the first boss. He's at that little window right there. And quite frankly, this first boss is awfully difficult for a first boss. Compared to the early bosses in Castlevania, this guy is pretty tough, because he throws sort of high and low fireballs randomly. There's really no way to sort of guess his pattern, so it's just sort of a matter of quick timing. It took me several tries to get through this guy, and remember you can't continue until after you have beat him, so really they should have toned this guy down a bit. And something that's also quite sadistic, after you defeat him, unlike say Castlevania, your life bar doesn't get refilled. And if you step outside at night, you can get instantly killed by one bolt of lightning. And that is one of the slightly annoying things about this game, is that it is kind of difficult to refill your life bar. This is a rather creative little level right here. There's all these little sort of trapdoors that you can step on. The game has very excellent level design. There are just certain gameplay flaws that make the game not as enjoyable as it should be. Something that is quite cool are the various little bonus rounds you'll find occasionally. For example, there's one hidden around here somewhere. As I recall, you actually have to hit it from underneath. Yes, there it is. Once you get this bonus round, you go around collecting the various notes, flats, and sharps, trying to, you get bonus money depending on how many you collect. And what's rather charming is that every time you get this level, another musician will start playing. And the musical theme will actually change slightly every time you play it. So like I was saying, it can be rather difficult to completely refill your life bar. The only time this sort of happens for free is when you collect a honeycomb. But you will often be done with a boss with not very much health left. And then you sort of have to go on to a new level, which can be quite difficult, and you often find yourself getting killed very quickly after you defeat a boss. Usually what I end up doing is going back to like an earlier room, killing enemies until I collect hearts, and then refilling my health bar that way, but that's a rather lengthy and boring process. Enemies drop hearts randomly, and sometimes it actually takes quite some time to refill an entire health bar simply by killing enemies. There's really nothing like the turkey in Castlevania or the fairies in Zelda that will fill up your health bar quickly. I should also mention that just like Zelda, this game has shops that are manned by sort of helpful little wizard guys who also give you hints. A lot of the items that you buy at shops will make it much easier to get through the game. For example, there's armor that makes it easier to get through a level that has a lot of fire in it. Another issue I have with this game is the fact that the bosses are all more or less the same. They look different, but they all have the exact same jumping pattern and the random high and low fireballs. In fact, once you've gotten through the first boss, you'll probably find the later bosses to be much easier because you have more health and you're starting to understand the pattern. Thus the difficulty of the bosses is actually sort of inverted. They get harder at the beginning and they get easier as you go along. So Milon's Secret Castle is a fun, well-made game, but there are a few issues that make it much less enjoyable than it ought to be. Hudson would actually improve on this formula a little bit later with their sequel for the Super Famicom called Do-Re-Mi Fantasy. That game was only released in Japan, but really is very cool. Still, Milon's Secret Castle can be a fun game if you put some effort into it. For the last game this episode, we're going to fire up the old Famicom disk system. This game is called Dead Zone. And it has, I'm sure, no relation to the Stephen King novel and movie. You'll notice the music is actually pretty nice, and really not very typical of Sunsoft. In fact, Dead Zone is nothing at all like previous Sunsoft releases for the Famicom. Most of their other games have been sort of simple platformer and action type games. And Dead Zone is actually a text adventure game. In fact, this is only the second Japanese text adventure game for the Famicom after Portopia. While this game has a science fiction theme, I'm really not exactly sure what it's about. It appears to take place in some sort of like abandoned space station or moon base or something like that. The game sort of starts you off puttering around with these old robots. You have to remove the batteries and whatnot out of them. Eventually move on to other areas of the space station. I certainly have not played this game all the way through, but I assume at some point some sort of plot starts occurring or something interesting happens. As with Portopia, all the commands are issued using a menu and your D-pad to make a selection. Unlike Portopia, a lot of the commands here are actually quite different. In Portopia, you're mostly talking with other folks, occasionally picking up an object or pressing a button or something like that. Here you interact almost exclusively with physical objects. The commands are things like take, open, move, carry, that sort of thing. So far I've yet to see any actual other characters in this game. Perhaps there's someone later on. The cover of the game box shows a female, and there's some robots mentioned in the opening credits. Perhaps the female is also a robot. Really hard to say. At this point, you're just sort of wandering around the base, looking at various objects. Unfortunately, because this game is entirely in Japanese, you probably won't be able to make sense out of most of it. Again, I'm assuming that something interesting does happen. There is some sort of payoff for all this kind of wandering around the space station or whatever. You're probably going to want to skip this game unless maybe at some point in the future someone decides to make a translation out of it. Unfortunately, very few of these Japanese text adventure games have been translated into English. Well, as those of you who have been following these episodes know, every week we count the number of games with ninjas in them and the number of shoot-'em-ups, and so far virtually every episode has had a few of these, but this episode we in fact have no ninjas whatsoever. Of course, there were 3 shoot-'em-ups. There was Terra Cresta, Super Star Force, and Ginga Denshou, but the lack of ninjas is pretty disturbing, and quite frankly, this is pretty much the way it's going to be from now on. It seems the ninjas have really sort of temporarily run their course on the Famicom. And actually, we'll be seeing a lot less shooters as well in the future. Shooters featured pretty heavily in 1985 and 1986. In 1987, perhaps not so much. What we're really going to see are a whole lot of platformers. Of course, next episode we will be seeing one of the all-time greatest shooters for the Famicom, as well as one of the all-time worst games for the Famicom. So hopefully we will see you then.